And so when we talk about temples, they have to do with sacred space, a special place set aside that is specifically for mankind to be able to connect directly with God or the gods. And so it gets into the whole thing of the science of the divine and the sacred in terms of, shall we go to the source itself of all of the gods? Or is there a particular manifestation or emanation of the divine that we specifically are wanting to connect with that is really what we're seeking? And so that wouldn't be the one God. It would be a manifestation or an aspect of that one God, which manifests in terms of what are known as the gods. So many, and I don't know to what degree that any of you have really thought about this, but if you really study the evolution of civilization, we're going to find that there is this whole major theme as far as Western man is concerned in terms of going from paganism to Christianity, or we could say from polytheism to monotheism, and how we deem that to be a much more elevated and a much more accurate representation of the divine. And it just depends on one's perspective, because the gods that the Greeks and the Romans and the Persians and the Chaldeans and the Hindus and all of this are worshiping, they're totally real. It isn't as if they're making this up. No, they're totally real. And so we're going to explain and talk about this. But before we do that, and this has a lot to do with the topic this evening, and so a number of you have had that personal experience of going into a cathedral or a mosque or a temple and felt the energy, and it's something different. And we want to be clear that when we start talking about the temple, but we're going to be talking about on many, many different levels, but the temple is specifically space set aside from the profane or mundane world that is dedicated to consciously connecting with the divine. And so these are sacred spaces, and they are positioned and they are designed based upon sacred architecture and cosmic law and the mind of God in ways that, quite frankly, most of this knowledge has been lost at the present time. But was the knowledge of the priesthood and special guilds of architects and masons, or those that actually their role was to travel around the ancient world, and whenever there was to be a temple to be built, a cathedral to be built, whatever, they were the ones that were hired and brought in to build it, because they were the ones who had the knowledge, the design. Because this gets into architecture, and it gets into planning. And one of the things is, in terms of, well, we could say, and this I'm going to get into here in a moment, but we could say that, and I'm using the term loosely, we'll get a little more specific about it, but God, if you will, and a creation. A creation is a manifestation of this supreme being, whatever name that we want to give it. And do you think that he or it would create a creation without a plan? No. I mean, the answer is no. And we're going to find this as cosmic law. And if you find in your own life you don't have a plan, you're going to probably find that you're not really accomplishing a lot and manifesting a lot. And in fact, we'll find that actually you do have a plan. It's just whether you're conscious and aware of it and working with it, which is your natal chart or horoscope, because that is your life plan. And it's a cosmic design. And the gods were involved in creating it along with yourself. On a vaster scale, when we really start talking about the whole creation, this being, whatever name that we want to give to it, that is the ultimate reality, it is a being of pure consciousness. It is a being of pure light and pure life and pure love and pure wisdom. And when we say pure, what we mean by that is we're talking about this being in its unmanifest form. When it's pure, it means it hasn't been differentiated. It hasn't actually taken form yet. That the actual raw material, if we use this term, is this pure consciousness. And as we have talked about in other classes, this being is in an eternal process of self-discovery through its creative expression. I want you to think about that for a moment, because how this being gets to know who and what it is through expressing itself through creations. And it is discovering and learning of itself as we are too, because we are aspects of this being. As much as people would maybe be aghast when we say something like this, hopefully not in this group, but we are, each and every one of us, expressions of this being. And we are the microcosm of the macrocosm. We are this being in miniature. And we are also, because we are part of this being, we are also in an eternal process of self-discovery through our creative expression. And that is what your life is. And this is you creating your life. And you are the creator of it, of all the good things and all of the screw-ups and everything else. You are the captain of your ship. But we're going to find then that when we go back and look at the bigger picture so that we really get more of a sense of this topic of the cosmic temple, then we're going to find that this being has a rhythmic expression of rest and activity just like we do in a 24-hour period. So we know that in a 24-hour period that there is daytime, which is dedicated to activity, and there's nighttime that is dedicated to rest. So we have this rhythmic alternation of rest and activity, rest and activity. And we find that this is the actual rhythm of life, even at the vastest cosmic level. So that we will find, and using the Vedic terminology, because we'll find that the Vedic tradition of ancient India has a precision and a clarity in terms of presenting the knowledge to us that some of the other traditions lack. And by the way, Veda in Sanskrit means knowledge. And so the knowledge that's being referred to in the Vedas is not human knowledge. It's cosmic knowledge. It's the knowledge of this being itself, the supreme being. And that knowledge that really is the basis and foundation of all of life and all of creation in all of its forms. And so mankind, because we are the microcosm of the macrocosm, are in a process of awakening to this knowledge. And the Vedas specifically have been cognized by rishis, which means seers, that really in that enlightened state are able to cognize the divine being, which we'll get into more as we go along. And in that state of being is able to actually directly experience the mechanics of creation, the very processes of creation, and all the cosmic laws and principles and forces and powers that manifest on the basis of every level of creation. So the Vedas themselves, thousands of these hymns, are these cognitions of different aspects of the creation and the divine being that is this creation, and really be able to discern and perceive deeply within life in terms of what it's really all about and how it works. So these are very significant. So using the terminology of the Vedas, what I just described of a time of activity and rest in this larger cosmic rhythm of cosmic day and cosmic night, a cosmic day is a manvantara. A cosmic night is a pralaya. And we're going to find a cosmic day is the length of a creation. And the length of a creation is 311 trillion, 40 billion years. So we're going to find, wow, that's kind of... I know, I'm not sure I do either. That's why I say it. It's easier to say than to write. And so here we have this rhythmic, so we'll find that life is in cycles. All life is in cycles. In time, we'll find that during a period of dissolution, which we could say life is eternal, and that creation is followed by dissolution, which is followed by another creation, which is followed by a dissolution. This has been going on eternally, and it will continue to go on eternally. So if you want to wrap your head around that, that kind of stretches things a little bit too, yes.
Okay, so is there really time?
Yes, because the intention unfolds through time. How could we measure 311 trillion 40 billion years if there wasn't time?
There's a lot of information out there that says all time is now.
Yeah, well, what information? No, I've heard that too. But it's all a state of perspective, because if you're enlightened, which probably most of the people that are saying this are not, but you are in the eternal now. But this is an experience. To really have that experience, that eternality is an omnipresent reality. But you have to be in that state of consciousness to really experience that, for it to be a reality. Otherwise, it's just an abstraction. Do you understand?
No.
There is time. In fact, we will find a divine plan or an intention or a manvantara has a specific period of time for this intention or this plan to unfold. So a creation unfolds through time. And to give you an idea, and we'll just use a silly little metaphor, in terms of the acorn. We know that if we have an acorn, that if we plant this acorn in the soil and we water and it gets sunshine, it turns into an oak tree. If we can actually say the oak tree is in the acorn, but it actually takes time for that acorn to turn into the oak tree. And in a similar way, we're going to find that it takes time for us as aspects of this being to actually unfold our awareness in order to have that state of consciousness that we realize that we are a living conscious aspect of God. This does not happen overnight. This is something that takes vast periods of cosmic time to unfold. But it is that reality for each and every one of us to fulfill that destiny, which each and every one of us will, in terms of realizing our true nature, which is that we are individualized expressions of the Supreme Being. And we are it, and then from that standpoint, we are then able to be conscious co-creators with God in terms of the completion and the fulfillment of the divine plan. Because each and every one of us has a role to play that only we can play. So this gets into very deep stuff, because it gets into these principles of unity and diversity and unity. Because ultimately, everyone and everything in this creation is one. It's made from the same being. It's made from the same source. It's made from the same consciousness. But the differentiation or the infinite diversity, just like we know the two snowflakes are not the same, two leaves are not the same, two human beings are not the same. Then inherent within all of this individualized expression is one of the inherent qualities of this being, is to express itself in infinite ways and infinite diversity, and in that way it is able to really experience that of itself. It's unbounded and unlimited in that regard. Yet, even though all these different life waves of spiritual beings are totally unique, and even though each snowflake is different from another snowflake, they all come from the same source and are made from the same consciousness. And so there's that underlying oneness or unity. So we're going to find that within every creation, one of the major themes that, or laws, cosmic laws, that is inherent within every creation is this principle of unity within diversity and diversity within unity. And we get stuck. It's just like talking about time and eternity. We get stuck because we're in this realm of duality where we think it's got to be this or that. And it's wrong, because it's this and that. It is time within eternity. Time is what actually measures eternity. And so we're going to find time is very important, because things have to unfold sequentially, even when we talk about a cosmic creation. Even when we talk about our own lives and how we had to go through being a toddler and then a youth and then an adult and then maturing. These are cosmic laws. They unfold through time. And within each phase of that life, of that growth, new qualities, new powers, new abilities are really being able to be brought out into expression. And our experience, as a result, is going to be quite different because we are growing in consciousness. Because one of the things that we want to understand with every creation, the theme is the growth and evolution of consciousness. And to give you an idea, so we could say, and this is again from the Vedic tradition, but they have beautiful ways of expressing it, so I'm kind of emphasizing that at the present time, but they will show, so there's a creation, and it goes through this whole period of birth, growth, decay, and death, where the whole divine plan evolves and unfolds and is completed, and when it's completed, then it dissolves, everything dissolves back into pure consciousness. And this is dissolution or pralaya, where there is a cosmic sleep, where there is a period of cosmic rest. And we can say that, okay, the karma of that creation that was completed is consolidated into a seed, like we could say the acorn. So that the karma, there's a seed of the karma of this creation that gets consolidated here. And we're going to find that the karma of the previous creation becomes the seed for the next creation. So when we start talking about karma, it's way beyond what we think of in terms of, the law of cause and effect, or as you sow, so shall reap on the level of human terms. It's a cosmic law. It relates to all life, that there is this law of karma. And so we'll find that we will find that this is the intention of this Supreme Being. And so that the next creation begins from the seed of the karma of the previous creation and then just unfolds to an even greater level. So we'll see a continuity that goes through all of these different creations. Just like we could say, in a similar way, in the process of reincarnation for each and every one of us, there's the seed of the karma of the life that we've just completed. We go into the spiritual worlds, and when it's time for us to reincarnate, we're going to find the karma for the previous lifetime. Becomes the seed for that next incarnation. And we're going to see the same thing is true in terms of creation. So these are cosmic laws. So we're going to see one of the pictures that in the Vedic tradition is kind of defining or explaining some of this is Vishnu. So they have Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva. Vishnu is the maintainer. Brahma is the creator. Vishnu is the maintainer. Shiva is the destroyer. And we're just being incredibly simple. But we're going to see this trinity that really is inherent with most of the spiritual traditions. And there's this picture of Vishnu floating on a lotus in the middle of the cosmic ocean of consciousness, where the entire creation is asleep. And within his palms is that seed of the karma of the previous creation that will become that which is the basis of the next creation. And the picture is that of the cosmic dissolution, or the pralaya, where it is in this state of quiescence, or sleep, or rest, in preparation for a new creation. And that picture, so we could say when this being wakes up from this cosmic sleep, it wakes up with an intention. It wakes up with an idea that it wants to put into action, that it wants to manifest. Just like, maybe this happens for you, I think it happens for everybody, but when you wake up in the morning, you may have an idea in your head. Oh, today I need to do this. We're going to find we are the microcosm of the macrocosm. When we start comparing these things, they're very similar, obviously on completely different levels. But when we really understand these things, it really can make us more conscious and more effective in this regard. But as it relates to this topic of the cosmic temple, we're going to find that when we look at this being, the supreme being, that is the basis of everything, including ourselves, we're going to find when it is beginning to be in a process of its creative expression or the beginning of a new creation, it only takes a part of itself to actually express through the creation. And we're going to find it's about a third of its being that it actually takes of itself and separates out in a certain respect to actually express as the creation. So just to kind of put this in perspective, how many of you have seen pictures from the Hubble telescope? Show of hands. Most of you. So one of the things that we're getting are vaster pictures of what this cosmos is. They're mind-blowing. Absolutely mind-blowing. And all we're talking about at this point is just that aspect of creation that we can actually see through the physical senses. Because this is the lowest level of creation. There's 7 cosmic planes, which we'll get into in the physical plane, is the lowest. So what we're actually seeing of the creation when we go out at night and we look at the sky, or we look at the Hubble, the pictures that the Hubble telescope is taking, is we're seeing just the physical aspect of the manifestation of this creation that is this being. And when we look at this, there's galaxies upon galaxies upon galaxies. There's hundreds of billions of galaxies that have already been identified by the Hubble telescope. Galaxies, not solar systems, not suns, so we're talking galaxies. And these are actually aspects, organs within the body of God. So as we'll tie this in terms of astrology and these kind of things, but the point that I want to make is that this being actually separates out of itself that part of itself and makes the space in order to create its creation. And so we're going to find that from the cosmic standpoint, the creation itself is actually the temple of God. And we're going to find it's defined and laid out by cosmic law. It gets into sacred geometry. None of this is by accident. It's all about number and math and geometry. And we're going to find that these represent cosmic laws within the intelligence, the supreme intelligence, the mind of God. The universal principle of creative intelligence is based on cosmic law. And here there is this manifestation. It actually is the manifestation that from a cosmic level is God's temple. And it is the creation. And it is created with that intent that this is sacred. And obviously the unmanifest aspect of this being is also sacred. And that's a whole another part. But we want to understand when we talk about the cosmic temple, this entire creation is a temple. And it's been set aside. One of the things we want to understand about a temple is it's sacred space that has been set aside for basically the communion of God and to really being able to experience the sacred. Because what is the creation? It is a process of this aspect of this being becoming conscious of itself through its creative expression. And so this creation is the process by which it increasingly expands its own awareness of its own being. But as we are aspects of it, we are in this eternal process of evolving our consciousness to greater and greater awareness of who and what we are and what this being is and what creation and what life is. So, we think of the temple in terms of going to the temple here in the world, and that's absolutely correct, but we want to have a more expanded view of what the temple really is from this cosmic standpoint. And as the creation becomes more refined, as it goes through its evolutionary process to where it is increasingly in a process of being able to sustain the awareness of the divinity of God, of the source of all of this, then we find the entire creation continues to expand its awareness and consciousness to come into that state of awareness of the divinity of itself and the whole creation. Yes?
Is there any indication of how many 3,400,000,000,000
311
cycles
trillion.
have been?
No, there may be so, but it's beyond me.
Okay.
So one of the things, but I'll give you I'll give you a story from the Vedas that kind of addresses that point. So Brahma is the creator being of the creation. And we would put that in our terminology as the Christ being, the Son of God, which is actually the creator being of our creation, not Jesus, the Christ. And so there's this Vedic story, and there's just, the Vedas are full of these. I mean, it's just, to me, it's a tradition that speaks deeply to me. And so there's this king that well, it's actually, let's just say, it is a creation, and it's Brahma. And Brahma is in his kingdom, in the celestial realms, in terms of overseeing the creation of which he is the creator. And he has his whole royal entourage and everything, because when we start talking about the gods, then there's just all kinds of levels of the spiritual hierarchy. So there's, when we get into this, it's a whole world in and of itself. But understood that the creator being is going to have vast armies, wrong word, but beings at its beck and call in terms of doing what needs to be done for the creation. And so this particular Brahma, this particular creator, during this particular creation, starts to get full of himself, starts to get arrogant, starts to get somewhat egotistical, and starts to, really get somewhat full of himself. And so there's various challenges and there's various warnings that are coming from higher ups that are saying, kind of watch yourself. You're kind of not in your integrity here, in terms of this. And he, he becomes so full of himself that he's a problem, and so he needs to be humbled somewhat. And so it's a sage, because these are all done. So a sage comes to him, to Brahma, and is going to really give him instruction. And he points down, the sage gets Brahma's attention, and he points down to the ground, and there's been this massive influx of ants that were going across the floor and through the room, just like, an ant invasion. And Brahma sees this, and he's kind of upset. And the sage gets his attention. He says, see all those ants? Every one of them was a Brahma. So basically saying, hey, you're playing a role here, and this is, you've got this responsibility, but don't get so full of yourself, because basically there's been thousands of you before, and there'll be thousands of you after, or holding this position. Because you want to understand, when we talk about a title like this, it's holding a position. When we start talking about the spiritual hierarchies, and not to demean them, they're vaster in light and consciousness and intelligence, but when we start talking about angels and archangels and archai and spirits of form and spirits of movement and spirits of wisdom and cherubim and seraphim, thrones, etc., think of it, to get a better understanding of it, think of it as the cosmic bureaucracy. These beings hold positions that have roles to play within the cosmic government. So to give you another idea, the Kabbalah is, so speaking of the creation, so speaking of the Kabbalah, and some of you may be familiar with the Kabbalah, but it's the more esoteric tradition of Judaism. It's just incredible stuff. It's beautiful. And so I don't know if any of you are familiar with the Tree of Life. The Tree of Life in the Kabbalah is a very fundamental archetype or teaching mechanism or design or representation that actually shows the creation and the process of creation and all the different spiritual hierarchies and all the different planes of the cosmos and all the different principles that are involved in manifestation. So when we start talking about manifestation, there would be what are called the Sephirot, and there's 10 Sephirot. There's Keter and Chokmah and Bina and Chesed and Gevurah and Tiphereth and Netzach and Had and Yesod and Malkut. So Kether means crown, and it's number 1. And this gets into all the thing that has to do with sacred geometry and number and math, because we're going to find that things manifest in sequence in a process of the highest descending, in a process that goes and manifests each one of the dimensional realities of creation, until Malkut, the 10th Sephirot, the bottom of the tree, is what represents this dense physical material reality. And also that if we look in the Hubble telescope and look out and we see all these galaxies, that is the creation at the physical level, because we can actually see it with our physical eyes. But it would be saying there's 9 other levels that are preceding this physical, that we had to actually, these processes, these 9 levels of manifestation or emanation, as they're specifically called in the Judaic tradition, that we're going to see from Keter, out of Keter, which is oneness, one. That's why the number 1. And it's the crown, which really means, and we're going to see the chakras and everything else, which we'll touch on. But we'll see then that it manifests in Chokmah. And that is the next level, which is wisdom. So in order to create, you have to have a plan, you have to have wisdom, you have to have the big picture, you have to understand the cosmic laws. So what is being formulated? In number 2, there's all of the divine intelligence, the wisdom and the understanding that is necessary to create a creation. And then that goes to Bina. And Bina then has to do with the beginning of differentiation. And that which is really where the unmanifest begins to manifest. And so what we want to understand is math and geometry and number are the cosmic laws of how spirit takes form. I'm going to say it again because it's really important. Because this whole creation is spirit that has taken form and everything within it. I don't care if it's the oak tree we're talking about or ourselves. We're a spirit that has taken form. But so are the stars and the galaxies and everything else. It is spirit that has taken form. And we're going to find that there are cosmic laws that rule, or basically are the principles of spirit or the unmanifest taking form and becoming manifest. So to me, it's a lot of the arguments or the conversations and the controversies in a lot of philosophy and science I find somewhat humorous, because when you really have an understanding of some of this stuff, and these are debates that have gone over hundreds and thousands of years, you can't create something out of nothing. That's a basic statement. Pardon?
Is there a beginning?
In each creation, there is a beginning. But is there a beginning to all this? No, it's never.
That was like,
Right.
really?
No, it's always been.
Right.
You have always been. You've never not been. This has never not been.
Therefore, there's no end.
There's no end, there's no beginning, and there's no end. But each creation, there's a beginning and there's an end. Okay? So those are good questions because, to clarify, those are good questions. But one of the classic things, I was just reading something this week and some scientific thing in this big debate about, you can't create something out of nothing. That's absolutely not true, because everything that's created is created out of no thing. Pure consciousness is not a thing. It's actually, and spirit is not a thing. It's that which is pure light. It's pure consciousness. It's the basis of everything, but it's no thing. And it's unmanifest becoming manifest. So I'd give you this example, because this is the same process that takes place in your own life. When you have a thought or an idea that you think is worthy of putting into action, and you put it into action, and you manifest it in concrete physical form, like a business or a book or a meal or a house or whatever it is, you've actually created something out of nothing. Because it's an idea. An idea, yes, we can say it is something, but it's consciousness. And when we have our physical scientists saying you can't create something out of nothing, they're talking about that which is physical. And we would actually find, when we talk about the etheric dimension, that everything in the physical has been manifested into the physical from the spiritual, including ourselves. We took form through passing through all of these same dimensional realities from the source as everything did. Every mountain, every tree, every star, everything else. And so it becomes important to really, kind of understand this. So when we talk about the tree of life, here is laid out. And the interesting thing is they have all the pathways between these Sephiroth. And this is something that is based on thousands of years of individual spiritual practice of human beings to actually experience and trace and actually reverse the process of rather than the descent of spirit into matter through the 10 Sephirot from the highest level of creation to the lowest level of creation. Since you're at this lowest level of creation in Malkut in the physical dimension, we can actually see the pathway to go through backwards the 9th, 8th, 7th, 6th, 5th, 4th, 3rd, 2nd, 1st, and go home to pure spirit, to that pure consciousness, because you contain it all within yourself. And you traverse this anyway when you die and you ascend through the spiritual worlds, and then when you have to reincarnate, you descend through all these dimensional realities and take form again. We have been doing this. It's called the Wheel of Life. We've been doing this forever. We know this pathway. And it is the same. We come into manifestation and ascend back to spirit and go the same way as every creation manifests and every creation is dissolved. So from a practical standpoint, we'll find that every dimensional reality, or every one of these numbers, or every one of these Sephirot, relates to a dimensional reality that is its own world or dimensional reality, just as the physical is this own dimensional reality with its own laws and its own beings and its own environment and its own intentions. So we're going to find,
authority levels almost?
Yeah. Well, I mean, they are manifestations. So basically, out of oneness, it generates and extrudes out of itself, or it emanates out of itself, the next lower dimension. And that dimension then is kind of an offspring of itself, and it contains a lot of what the parent, and we could think of it as a parent having a child. And then that child having, growing up and being an adult and having a child. And then we've got this lineage, and it starts going down. Well, I'm just making it human in that regard. But we'll find that each one of these dimensional realities generates out of itself its offspring, which is the next lowest dimensional reality.
Known in this level, and this level's a bit more understood.
Right, right. And so we find the Kabbalists call this emanations, that each dimension emanates out of itself that which is the next lowest level. And so we're going to find that this process goes on until we get down to the physical Malkut, the physical dimension. And if we talk about the tree of life, and this gets into all this esoteric stuff about, the knowledge, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, there were two trees in paradise. One was the tree of life, and one was the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Well, we're talking about the tree of life, because that really is really what we're about. But the reason we descended into Malkut was, this is the story in Genesis of Adam and Eve eating of the apple of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, meaning we had to descend into that dimensional reality where the reality was polarity, duality, and opposites, light and darkness, good and evil, right and wrong, masculine, feminine, positive, negative, where the reality of the oneness is differentiated into two-ness, which potentially creates conflict. And we battle. We're going to find, if we get esoterically into this in terms of understanding it from a whole other perspective, in terms of the seven rays, which has to do with the light and its differentiation in terms of color, and each color is a specific state of consciousness, yet it's all contained in white light. If you basically took a prism up to sunlight, you're going to see the sunlight differentiated into the seven colors of the spectrum. And this will relate to everything from the chakras and the subtle bodies and the dimensional realities and all kinds of things. But we will find that the fourth ray, cosmically, is that which rules human evolution. And guess what the fourth ray is? It's harmony through conflict. That is what the fourth ray is about, and that is very much what this physical dimension is about. Harmony through conflict. And the conflict is created through this nature of polarity and duality and opposites, and the need for basically balancing, harmonizing, and integrating this and reestablishing the wholeness. But because of the way things have been set up in duality, these have a tendency to battle each other until they've really come into that higher state where they've unified back into oneness. But we will find that to really kind of complete the picture, the cosmic temple that is being created by a creation, by the Supreme Being, its ultimate perfection, or the ultimate goal of the whole creation, is to manifest that divine intention in the physical dimension or the lowest dimension of reality. So all of these other levels, dimensional realities, are actually part of the substructure, if you will, for that which is the physical in which the divine intention is to reach its perfected expression. It's not to reach its perfected expression in the etheric dimension or the astral dimension or the lower mental or the higher mental, but we're going to find they all play a role, and all of these dimensional realities interpenetrate the physical. So right here, and we want to be real clear, I don't care if I'm talking about my body or the space in front of me, all these dimensional realities are right here. They all interpenetrate each other. They're not somewhere off there, they're omnipresent. And they actually interpenetrate. And that's one of the reasons why we are designed in a way that without going anywhere, we can be in conscious communion with every level of creation and be actively involved consciously at every level of creation, because every one of those levels is structured inside of us and interpenetrating us, and it's omnipresent, not just within ourselves. It's right here. It's everywhere. And so we're going to find that the sacred is right here. So it's all a relative kind of a thing. But we will find that in earth, so the building of the temple is a metaphor in the spiritual traditions, that we are the builders of the temple, in that it requires mankind, individually and collectively together, to create the cosmic temple, which, if we're going to say, is heaven on earth. Is to create and manifest in the physical the lowest level of creation. It is, think of Malkut, which means the kingdom, that it is the apple. So if we talk about a tree, there's a couple of things about this tree, because this is the tree of life. And then we're used to trees here. We've got plenty of trees around. And we know that a tree, it's got its roots in the earth, and it puts out its roots, and it has its trunk, and it puts out its branches, and it is really reaching for the heavens. It's rooted in the earth, and it's reaching for the heavens. The Kabbalistic cosmic tree of life is totally reversed. Its roots are in the heaven. That's the source. What is the root? Actually, technically, if we get into plant kingdom, I'm going off on a lot of tangents, but getting into the plant kingdom, the roots are the brain of the plant. The roots are the brain of the plant. And you're going to find that a regular plant on earth, it's putting its roots down into the earth, because it's basically getting all its knowledge and energy and sustenance from the earth. And I mean knowledge, just gets into gnomes and nature spirits and all kinds of interesting things. But the actual cosmic tree is the reverse. The roots are in the heavens. Why? Because this is where we get all our sustenance and knowledge. And then the trunk comes down, which we can think of it as these different dimensional realities, and the branches going out being the manifestation of these different levels of creation. But then what is the ultimate fulfillment of the tree? Yes, exactly right. It gets into the apple thing, but it gets into all kinds of other things too. So Malkut, the kingdom, is the fruit of the cosmic tree, meaning the physical dimension is the fruit of all of the activity of the cosmos.
The entire physical creation.
Mm-hmm.
Not us specifically, but the entire creation.
Yeah, but we're a key part of it, because we're the agency of it. We're the ones that water the root and feed the root and feed the tree and basically get it to grow the fruit, because it doesn't do it on its own. The perfection of the divine plan, we will find we are, when we evolve to that point, we are the conscious co-creators with God of the divine plan. The plan cannot be completed without mankind consciously playing its role. We do all the finish work. If you were doing a house, when you put up the foundation and the frame and everything else, but then you got to get the people in as completely different skills to do all the finish work. Well, think of mankind as that part of this whole thing of the divine plan of doing the finish work. And it requires us to become enlightened. We have to become self-realized. We have to realize who and what we are and really come into direct conscious communion with the divine plan and what our specific personal role is in order for us to do what it is we're supposed to do, which we can simply call our dharma, our spiritual purpose, the law. We can speak of it on many different levels. So, yeah, when we look at the fruit of the tree, it is this physical dimension, and then it is, in terms of the gardener of the physical dimension, we could say is humanity. Yes.
What if we blow it?
We are blowing it. So you see the consequences.
It's not like you can refuse to do your homework, is it? I mean, you can refuse.
You can refuse. We have free will choice. That's the wild card.
Yeah.
That's the wild card. We have free will choice.
So then Shiva comes, destroys it all, and we start another cycle.
No, we destroy it. But it's Shiva's influence because he's the destroyer. But every one of us has within us the powers of Brahma and Vishnu and Shiva. We are the Trinity. We are the microcosm. We can create, we can maintain, we can destroy. That's our choice. But yes, I mean, the bigger answer to your question is there will be no failure.
Thank you.
We will have problems. We will have crises, but there will be no failure.
When you refuse to do your homework, you have consequences.
Absolutely. Stay after school. It means we retarded and coming back 100 times instead of 10 in terms of reincarnation. No, I mean yeah, Brad.
So the harmony through conflict bumps up our consciousness.
Absolutely.
So before we have this dualism, we're at this one point where there's only this
Right.
level of consciousness. You come to dual and have all this.
Right.
And then
That's
you have a
very
higher level that
perceptive.
knocks you above it.
Because if you're in oneness, there's no activity and there's basically no contrast.
The way we love.
And then if there's no contrast, then you don't grow consciousness. If you really want to know a secret, and maybe it will make you feel better, especially now and in the times to come, consciousness grows through suffering. But I think if you look back on your lives, you're going to see that when you go through tough times and you are struggling, there is a tremendous growth in consciousness. And if not, then you haven't been dealing with the crises correctly. And we have that free will choice as to whether to blow it or not. But there will be a time, you'll keep coming back until you get it right. So, you know, it's whether you want to stay after school or you want to leave on time. So, anyway, and a lot of what I'm telling you is metaphor, but I'm sure it's absolutely true. And it's taking some pretty deep, heavy stuff and trying to really make it understandable and in a meaningful way, because we are building the temple. So I'm going to go, so we have a certain picture here in terms of the creation and the process and these kind of things, and this is the cosmic temple. Now I want to shift, well, I want to mention, it's one of the reasons I'm into astrology, and actually there are a bunch of astrologers here tonight, but when we actually study the stars, we're going to find that they are the key to this whole thing. And we're going to find, you know, if astronomers look out there at the stars, they're going to say, oh yeah, and these are balls of gas, and they have a certain spectrum of light, blah, 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 blah. They're this old, and they're this far away based upon, you know, all of these various mathematical calculations that they do. We want to open up your understanding in terms of these kinds of things, because stars are colonies of spiritual beings that have evolved together that actually embody very precise, very specific cosmic qualities of consciousness, and they embody within themselves cosmic laws to where they are manifest and holding this energy and consciousness for the whole creation. So a star is actually a manifestation of light, which is the emanations of a colony of spiritual beings that have inherent within it very precise and specific qualities of consciousness. No two stars the same, just as we know there's no two snowflakes the same. Well, there's definitely no two stars that are the same. And we're going to find that each one of those stars is a collection of spiritual beings that have a shared collective consciousness that is the result of their own evolutionary process that embodies a specific aspect of cosmic law. And to put it another way, as interestingly science is beginning to make these connections, that there are trillions of stars. And they're now beginning to equate the trillions of stars to the trillions of cells within the human brain. And if we really want to understand this, each one of these stars is a cell within the brain of God. And so when we start then tuning in, and we're going to see as we get into earthly temples, each one of these temples has specific orientations that are definitive. It's like you going to the Ganesh temple because you wanted to connect with Ganesh. And there's specific protocols and ways of doing that. We're also going to find that when we get into the science of temples, that these are more the ancient temples because most of this has been lost. We're going to find every one of these temples is aligned to a particular star or a particular constellation to which that energy or consciousness of the intention of that specific temple is directly connected. And the orientation, so when we start getting into this, and when people build churches today, they don't, it could be in a strip mall, I mean, there's no understanding of this. And it doesn't mean that it can't become sacred space. It can't. But there's a science to this that's been lost. And it was lost with a fellow by the name of Vitruvius. I don't know if any of you are familiar with Vitruvius, but he was that individuality that collected all of the sacred knowledge related to sacred architecture in the Roman Empire. And it was when Rome was still building these temples all over. And it's his knowledge that came down in certain forms in the West, but it's pretty much been lost. But he was kind of the last living individual in this regard. And we'll get into some other parts of this. But so shifting then to earthly temples. Now we kind of talked about the cosmic temple. And now the earth is the microcosm of the macrocosm also, and the earth is a living being. And we're going to see that it has its own physiology and it has its own structure. But the thing about astrology, so the mapping of the body of God is very much what astrology is about. Astronomy is there, but astronomy places no meaning. It basically is, identifying all these stars and planets and various things. But as far as astronomy is concerned, there's no meaning behind that. So, but with astrology, there's meaning. And that makes a big difference. And so we'll find that studying of the heavens, that studying of the stars, is really the studying of the mind of God, the universal principle of creative intelligence, and of the ability to know and understand the divine plan. And that's really what astrology has been about since the beginning. And so the sacred architecture, if you will, of the cosmos is that which has been the study of mankind through astrology and other esoteric arts and sciences for thousands and thousands of years. And so it's as relevant today as it was then. And we're going to find then when we move then from the cosmos to the earth that we have quite a history in terms of temples physically here on the earth. Because ancient mankind was still conscious and aware of the sacredness of life. We were still clairvoyant. We could still see and work with the gods and actually see into the spiritual worlds and see and understand these deeper things that we've been talking about. And so we're going to find, though, again, they felt that it was necessary in order to set space aside. And it goes into this principle that has to do with separating the sacred from the mundane, or the sacred from the profane. And we say the mundane and the profane, we mean the worldly stuff. Okay, we got to go out and make a living. We got to go out and work. We got to go to get groceries. We got to clean the laundry. We got to do the worldly stuff we got to do in terms of taking care of the physicality of our being. And that's the mundane. That's the profane. But then every society has felt the need to take a special space and make it sacred, or it's already sacred in truth, because they had the ability to identify those places on the earth that had to do with sacred spots or energetic spots or geomantic spots that were empowered in ways that were very different from the surrounding space. And this gets into geomancy, which we'll touch on for a bit. But what I'd like to do, and just to give you an idea, is go back to Atlantean times. And so, yes, we were all Atlanteans. Yes, we were all there, and it was real and all that. But it was a prior phase of our evolution. And Atlantis was very, very enlightened in many respects. There was no self-conscious awareness. We didn't have any awareness of being an individual self. It was still very much a group consciousness, and also their intellect hadn't really unfolded. We were basically in communion with the gods, so we basically were like children. We did what they said. So we hadn't learned to think for ourselves, except for when we started choosing to screw up, which we were good at doing because we destroyed Atlantis, and we destroyed Lemuria, and we will destroy this too, but it's about 6,000 years from now. And so we're going to find back in ancient Atlantis, and these were called oracles. There was an oracle or a temple to each one of the planets. So there was an oracle of the sun, there was an oracle of the moon, there was an oracle of Mercury, an oracle of Venus, an oracle of Mars, an oracle of Jupiter, an oracle of Saturn. And these temples were dedicated to those intelligences that indwelled those planets, because these are not dirt clods just orbiting the sun. They are actually living worlds with spiritual life waves of beings. They may not be physical and be like us, but we're going to find that there are spiritual hierarchies, angelic hierarchies that are expressing through each one of these planets that are very much involved in terms of what is going on here and the whole divine plan. And so it became important. Mankind knew that it was critically important that we stay in conscious communication with these intelligences that were deeply involved in the affairs of mankind and this divine plan and the unfolding of this divine plan. And so if there were things that were needed in terms of the sun, then the individual would go to the temple of the sun. Things were needed in terms of the moon, then the individual went to the temple of the moon, etc. And we are going to find that the oracle, actually there was a high priest or priestess that was that individuality that was in that state of conscious communication with that intelligence of that particular planet or star. And so that the knowledge or advice could be accessed through this individuality. So these were sacred precincts. These were places that were set aside that had to do with maintaining this conscious communication between mankind and these spiritual hierarchies in terms of the guidance of mankind. So hopefully we wouldn't stray off of the divine plan, and we would stay aligned in this regard. And we will find that each temple has its own design based upon the intelligence it's connecting with. The sacred geometry, we don't have temples that are just universally formed for every god or goddess. You're going to find that there are specific designs for specific gods and specific goddesses that are directly connected with the harmonics and the geometry that is necessary to create the sacred space in order to make the connection between humanity and the gods. And so here you will find that the designs of these different temples were unique and different. And this has to do with the structure, and it has to do with sacred geometry and the design. And we're going to find this whole thing of sacred geometry is fundamental in terms of the whole creative process, from unmanifest to manifest, from the creation itself to that which really, if we intend to create sacred space, we want to really know and understand these laws and rules so that we can create that space so it'll be to the best, it'll be most effective in terms of serving the purpose that it is to serve. And one of the things that we also would like to clarify, so this is facilitating. The temple is here to facilitate mankind's communion with the gods, but also, and this is again another one of the controversies that you will encounter when we study archaeology, anthropology, history, etc., and that is that there's all of these teachings and traditions that say that mankind is actually able to invoke the gods to come and reside in the temple. And even it was a thing in Egypt where they were invoked into the actual statues. So a particular statue of a god, we'd say that's ridiculous, that's absurd. How could the god be in a statue? But we'll actually find this is very real, because it has to do with invoking and knowing how to create the proper dwelling place for this god to where it would actually be comfortable here and want to be here. And it's an aspect of this god. I'm not saying the whole god is here. But literally, when we talk about the ancient temples, you want to understand that the gods actually indwelled those temples. And so when you went in those temples, you definitely had powerful experiences. And of course, that facilitated mankind's ability to have this connection with the gods, and that the gods were right there. They're right here. And they still are, but to the degree that we want to work with them effectively, we need to create a proper dwelling place for them, which gets into the sacred geometry, which gets into the sacred architecture of temple structure, which is a universal art and science that's been all over the world. So this was the basis of Atlantean culture and civilization. In fact, you find that the temple was always the center of the community, and it was always the priesthood, or those people, the initiates, that had been through the initiatic experience and been trained and were familiar with the gods, that were then, let's say, pushed out or led out into the community to become the leaders of the community in a temporal sense. But they had deep spiritual background and deep spiritual connections, and so they were more enlightened masters, if you will, that were leading society. And that's one of the reasons that these societies lasted for thousands of years, because they were based in the light, and their societies were based in cosmic law, and they were still connected with the divine. What do we have? You think there's a lot going on in this respect in Congress right now? I mean, this is just to give us some contrast, to give us an idea of where we are at the present time. So here, and even though, how many of you have ever been to the National Cathedral in D.C.? Cool, very good. Because we have our own cathedral here, and it took almost 100 years to build, too. It just got finished in 1990. But anyway, we'll get into cathedrals in a minute. But anyway, so we're going to find that one of the things, and it was one of the things I've been involved with. So one of the things is as the end times, because actually Atlantis went down in 3 phases over thousands of years. So it wasn't some sudden thing where poof, everything was gone all at once. But colonies went out. We're going to find actually Egypt was a colony of Atlantis. So they wonder, one of the things about anthropologists and archaeologists and historians about Egypt, they think it's a real anomaly. It's really weird because you actually encounter Egyptian culture and civilization at its height. And then from there, we see a decline over a number of thousands of years. But usually with a civilization, there's a process of birth, and there's a process of growth, and then a process of decay and process of death. But there's no process of birth and growth here in the Egyptian culture and civilization. Our academics can't figure out, this is totally weird, but they kind of just slough it off in the corner and don't really, it's one of those enigmas they'd rather not try to figure out because it will really unravel their whole theory of life and mankind. But also we will find that in Europe, in Western Europe, the Atlanteans established these same oracles and initiatic centers, and that was where I would take people to these sacred sites in Europe for a month at a time over a number of years earlier. And we will find that the way they're aligned is, well, and some of you will be familiar with it, but it begins in Spain with Santiago de Compostela. And then we go to Toulouse in France, and Orleans in France, and then Notre Dame, and then Chartres, and then Amiens, all in France, and then Rosslyn in Scotland. And we are going to find that these relate to the 7 chakras. And they go from Santiago de Compostela being the root chakra, up to Rosslyn, Scotland being the crown chakra. And it was part of the process of the spiritual path back in Atlantean times and ancient post-Atlantean times, that an individual would go to what is now, because of course we're giving the modern names, because it wasn't Santiago de Compostela back then, but this area of Spain. And in the oracle, that would be the moon oracle, which rules the root chakra, we would find that the person would stay in this initiatic mystery center oracle until they'd mastered everything that was related to the moon and the root chakra, etc. And once they'd mastered that, then they would move to Toulouse, which would then be the sexual chakra, and they would go through all the processes of initiation and training and mastery of that. And once they'd finished that, then they would go to Orleans, and Orleans was the solar plexus chakra, and they would go through that initiatic process and master these processes and etc. And then they would move to Notre Dame, which was the heart chakra. And then they would go through all of that was initiation and training to master that, which was the heart chakra. And then from there they'd go to Chartres and would find that was the throat chakra. And this also gets into a lot of stuff for those of you who've been at Chartres, and especially the school of Chartres. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it was the preeminent light in the Middle Ages. And it has to do with the 7 liberal arts, and it gets into the same thing. We talk about the 7 liberal arts, it's about the same thing of opening up the 7 chakras. And they relate to everything from astronomy to rhetoric to grammar to math, geometry, etc. And it has to do with cultivating and culturing these different aspects of ourselves. So this was part of the training of initiation, was mastering these bodies of knowledge in cosmic and mundane sense. So Chartres was the throat chakra. Amiens was the brow chakra. And then you would go through, and this was opening up clairvoyance. They had clairvoyance, but it was refining it. And the other thing to know about this, I'm being very loose about this whole thing and very quick because it's, as I think you can sense, a vast amount of knowledge. But each one of these chakras has petals. Are we aware that every chakra has petals? And every one of those petals is a whole another dimension of that particular chakra, and you have to master all of the petals. So when we get to Rosalind, what's this chakra? 1,000-petal lotus. So here, but we've been working on this all the way up. So here, these are actually in the landscape. These were sacred sites, and this gets into geomancy. So when we then start talking about the structure of the earth as being a living body, and we've talked about this in other classes, but how we are directly connected energetically with Ursa Major, which is the Great Bear, which is that which is next to the North Pole or the Pole Star. And that basically there is this stream of energy that goes into Avebury in southern England. And Avebury, as far as the earth is concerned, is the navel chakra. And we are going to find that all this cosmic energy that is the basis, because it's showing evolutionarily in terms of the gods of this realm of Ursa Major, have a very primary influence in terms of human evolution and the destiny of mankind and the earth. And so we're going to find that the umbilicus, or the umbilical cord, comes from Ursa Major to the earth at Avebury. And that then we find that which the ancients call the Ouroboros, but that which then becomes this primary loop of energy around the earth that goes basically from Avebury through this area that would be around New Zealand and around again, is, in the symbolic picture, was a snake with its tail in its mouth, which has to do with these energies, earth energies, but also a lot of other things. And then from this starts differentiating off all the matrices of the ley lines that have to do with the etheric body of the earth and all the geomantic structures in the earth, which is a whole other topic for another time. But it's also that 1,776 stars of our galaxy actually have direct connections into our earth as domes that are direct. It's like thinking of a suction cup on the earth. It's 33 miles wide and 16 miles high, and it has an energetic connection with a star like Sirius is one of the most important, and it goes right into Avebury. And Canopus is the other one, and Sirius is the masculine and Canopus is the feminine, and it relates directly to the Ida and the Pingala, for those of you who are familiar with esoteric physiology from the standpoint of the chakras, etc. And the Sushumna is that basic line from Ursa Major into Avebury. But anyway, I'm just giving you, and so there's 1,776 of these stars that have direct energetic connection into the Earth. And so those influences are there. And I'm just giving you just a brief picture of the subtle body, of the etheric body of the Earth, where basically it's the cosmic body, where all of this cosmic energy is coming in very specific ways and creating the whole life body or etheric body of the Earth. Well, the ancients were aware of this. They could identify this stuff. And so they placed their temples in these sacred geomantic spots where the earth energies and the celestial energies combined in ways that suited their intentions in terms of establishing communication with these intelligences of the stars, of the galaxies, etc. So we're going to find one of the basic things is orientation in terms of these temples. And they most all had certain orientations of the sun and moon. Those were pretty basic. But what scientists and archaeologists and astronomers are beginning to discover just in the past 20 years, and this has to do with examining 200 megalithic structures in England, Ireland, England, and Scotland over the last 20 years, is that each one of these is oriented to a different star system. And each one of them is unique, even though most of them are megalithic circular structures, but they're not all that way. And they had to do with the risings and settings of specific stars that they were connected into. And there were some that are larger, like Avebury and Stonehenge, etc., that really just had a whole massive amount of stars and planets that they were really involved in aligning with and working with, etc. So you had some of these, and let's be really clear, these megalithic structures are temples. These are temples. This was where sacred activity and a sacred place was set aside, sacred activity was dedicated to this, and the whole design was totally based on sacred geometry, and part of the whole thing about the temple is creating that space where the celestial and the terrestrial are able to meet and commune. And so when we then talk about the positioning of these temples and these megalithic structures, and they're not just in Great Britain, they're also in France and Germany and Spain and Portugal. But the massive amounts of them are primarily in England, Ireland, and Scotland. Yes?
Is this because we're in the Western Europe epoch?
These were set up, well, that's a good point, yes, and they have been set up. These are all post-Atlantean. And as we've talked about before, the kind of, those roughly 25,000 individuals that Manu identified as being the basis for the post-Atlantean evolution that is us, their kind of base from getting out of Atlantis before it went under was Ireland, England, and Scotland. And we're going to find that the northern mysteries stayed in northern Europe. The southern mysteries went to the east, to Asia, and then systematically moved west. We are now at that point in the fifth post-Atlantean epoch, which is Western Europe, where these two have come together. And one of the things that's happening in this regard is we're recovering the northern mysteries. The northern mysteries are very much the basis of these megalithic structures. And so what we're looked at in a really kind of primitive way, up till the last 20, 30 years, viewpoints are changing incredibly, because these megalithic structures are actually, they've identified, were built 1,000 years before the pyramids. So if we start looking at, how history has been taught in terms of the beginning of civilization, they're having to revise a bunch of things.
Is it your impression that they're getting it?
Yeah.
That they're writing it?
Yeah, but it's not mainstream yet. It'll take a while for mainstream. But let's just say those on the cutting edge are getting it and publishing, and it's getting out there. Yes. What I'm talking about is in written form by reputable scientists and astronomers. I'm trying to think of this guy's name. He spent 25 years going around, and he's an engineer, and he's a scientist, and he's also an astronomer. And he's the primary guy. And he's written, I have his books, I can't remember. Anyway, doing what I just said in terms of these megalithic structures. So he just went around all all over Great Britain, and basically he's got all the diagrams, all the alignments. This is like an architect drawing an architectural plan for building a building. It's as scientific as you can get. So there's all that. That's another example. So we're looking at the oracles, and one of the things about these oracles, the Atlantean oracles I mentioned, is, as Christianity happened, then they built on it. Every ongoing civilization, would identify the sacred sites and then build their temples on it. So you kind of have this thing, and of course Christianity thought anything that was pagan was bad. So literally when you go to these places, because we would go to them and work with these spots as initiatic mystery centers, you run into all of the spells and all the curses that the Christian priests put over these energies because they were considered pagan. And so when you get to these places, which is a lot of the major cathedrals, you're actually, to the degree you sink into it, you're going to encounter a great deal of energetic conflict, because they've tried to chain these nature forces and beings so that they don't express. And this is this whole battle between Christianity and other perceptions of spirituality. So anyway, it's interesting. But these places are unbelievable. They're awe. When you talk about going into awe, unbelievable stuff, and just incredible stuff. And I was there for in all of these different places with many services. And we'll get into the cathedral bit here in a minute. But then if we look at the examples of Egypt, for example, in the pyramids, and one of the things, again, this is another thing that's being chipped away at in terms of the Egyptologists and the kind of traditional, conventional viewpoint of Egypt and all of this. They'd say, okay, all these pyramids are tombs. They're not tombs. And in fact, they had the lands of the dead, and it had to do with orienting to the west of the river. And I'm not saying that there aren't things on the east side of the river, but if you go into the Great Pyramid and you go into these other pyramids, you're not going to find any evidence that they were tombs. Yes, there's a sarcophagus there, but the Great Pyramid was an initiatic center. It was a mystery temple, and that was where people were initiated, and they went into what was called the 3-day temple sleep, where they were put into a state of suspended animation as if they were dead, and they went into the spiritual worlds for a 3-day period and ascended through those spiritual worlds, encountered all the spiritual hierarchies and spiritual beings, and really connected with all this. So they really knew and understood what the divine plan was and all the structure of creation, and they came back with memory of it, and they were known as initiates. And so you're going to find that these are initiatic temples, and that's actually what temples. There's various levels of specialization of function within temples. There was the outer temple where regular people could go for various rites, and there was the inner temple that only the high priest or the high priestess and the very select few could go. And that's where the actual communion with the gods really took place. So it was the Holy of Holies. There were these various levels of this. But one of the things that Graham Hancock has kind of turned things up, and he's written a number of books recently, but he's the one who kind of started the Orion mystery, if you've heard of that. And he basically identified the pyramids on the Giza Plateau, where these 3 primary pyramids are, and their odd placement and their odd and differentiated size, he actually identified corresponded to the stars in the belt of Orion. And that basically, okay, there's something going on here. And then when they started looking at the orientations of parts of these pyramids, they also saw that they were oriented towards Orion. And of course, this resulted in incredible controversy. It was like, hornet's nest as far as Egyptologists were concerned, because they really give no. But one of the basic things you want to understand is that modern scientists do not want to acknowledge that there could have been a time earlier in evolution where mankind was more sophisticated and more knowledgeable than we are. And so anything that really points to these significant abilities, no, they got to destroy it, because there's a certain amount of arrogance and egotism in terms of our scientific community. And I could hundreds of examples, but this is just one. Anyway, subsequent scientists have continued that research, and they've actually found that in expanding the area that they were looking at, that they found that the pyramid structures of this whole greater area were not just as the belt of Orion, but the entire constellation of Orion. And they actually took the heavens and manifested them on the earth. They took this constellation and every one of the stars of the constellation, and they actually built a pyramid. Now, pyramids, pyramid, this was other classes, but does anyone know what pyramid means? It's Greek. It means fire within. And the very shape of a pyramid, I mean, how many of you are familiar? I actually had a number of years with a guy who kind of had this breakthrough thing from San Jose State about pyramid power. You guys read the books or, the various little doohickeys that he created to do this, to, keep milk for 3 months and sharpen your razor blades and all that kind of stuff. You won't be able to. No, that's different. You meditate, and you wouldn't be able to sleep. No, you meditate in a pyramid. Because the fire within, the very shape of a pyramid, we're going to find that the triangle or the tetrahedron, which is a three-dimensional expression of it, is the actual geometric form of the element of fire. And fire is spirit. And we're going to find that the very form of a pyramid creates fire within. And guess what? Where that fire is created in the Great Pyramid, it's where the sarcophagus is in the king's chamber. And this is where the initiations took place. And fire is spirit. So when we then start talking about understanding sacred geometry and structure and architecture and creating forms, because what is this? This is spirit taking form. And to the degree that we know and understand this, and we create the proper forms, we create the conditions very consciously in terms of what it is that we're wanting to manifest. And this is exactly what the Egyptians were doing. They were creating these pyramidal structures in order to create the fire within, which created the initiatic experience for people to ascend through to the higher dimensional realities and have the 3-day temple sleep. And then, of course, what is a star? It's fire, which is light and heat. And we get into this. So here, and then also if we wanted to look at the actual geography of ancient Egypt, and you look at the Nile as the sacred holy river, think of that as the spine of Egypt. And if you start looking at the sacred cities, with Heliopolis being the primary sacred city, and Helios means the sun, Opolis means so the city of the sun, these were temple cities, and they were right along the Nile, and they lined up just like the chakras I just described in terms of Western Europe. These people knew and understood the structure of creation, the structure of the world, the earth, and we're going to see very much the structure of the human being. And so when we then look at the ziggurats, these are the temples of the Chaldeans, Mesopotamians, and these were stepped pyramids, but they were temples. And basically they were observatories, and they were stargazing. And the Chaldeans were the ones who, kind of officially, culturally, on a massive cultural level, brought astrology to mankind. So once clairvoyance got shut off for us, then we were given the knowledge of the stars about how to read the mind of God from the stars, as opposed to having the clairvoyance, seeing into the spiritual world and working with the gods in that form. And again, we're going to find that the ziggurats, these step pyramids, they started from the planet Saturn, and they were color-coded. They were 7 layers, and they related to the 7 sacred planets, and each one of them went up, that every layer and every section of the pyramid related to one of the planets, so that the entire pyramid incorporated within it the 7 sacred planets, and the entire thing was oriented to the stars and the planets. These people had a cosmic culture. They had a spiritual culture. And then we will find similar things with the Mayans. And most of you, I'm sure, have been to the Mayan ruins and civilizations. I mean, if you go to Chichen Itza, they've got the Caracol, which is the observatory. But if you go, I think I've talked about this in other classes, but the main pyramid, the Pyramid of the Sun there, this Pyramid of Kukulkan.
There was a documentary on Netflix where they actually went from Egypt and spread out, and some of the temples in South America and stuff were on the same lines.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Latitudinally, you're going to see Egypt, Mexico, and even the ones in China are all on the same latitude. I don't know how many of you have seen the pyramids in China. They're mind-boggling. Those whole vast regions are just covered with pyramids. There's nothing out there. I mean, at this point, there's just these aerial photos. It's just mind-blowing. So there was this universal knowledge, and it actually goes back to Atlantis, because Egypt was a colony of Atlantis, and these things, it's like, anyway, the culture gets distributed around the world, so there were still these bases of this culture as colonies once Atlantis went under, and that's the reason why, they can't find a birth and a growth to Egyptian culture. They see it at its heyday and declining because it was transplanted there from Atlantis. The birth and growth was in Atlantis. And you'll find these things in Mexico, etc. So anyway, hopefully we get a sense of this ancient culture and civilization of mankind, in terms of temple architecture and the knowledge of how to commune with God and the various gods by aligning in a geographical sense, in terms of energetically, geomantically, in terms of the earth, but also in terms of alignment with the stars in order to create that place of communion, if you will, between heaven and earth and mankind being in the middle of that. Ultimately, the ultimate temple, archetypally, the ultimate archetypal temple is the Temple of Solomon. And I think most of us have probably heard about the Temple of Solomon. And of course, for us as Westerners, it's major when we get into the Judeo-Christian tradition. Everybody's heard of the Temple of Solomon, right?
Can't visit it, though.
No. And why is that? Does everybody know the answer to that? Okay, I think so. Long gone. 70 AD. Anyway, so second time, actually third, because there were three. Herod. So anyway, we'll get into that. So there were actually three manifestations of the temple. And the last one was wiped out in 70 AD. And what sits there now?
There's a mosque.
There's actually two.
Okay.
Kind of a problem. You know that it's actually written within the Israeli Constitution that Israel must rebuild Solomon's temple? It's in the Constitution of the country.
That's a problem.
Because I think all of you are aware of this, but if you're not aware of it, the Dome of the Rock and the El Aqsa Mosque are both on the site of Solomon's temple. And for Solomon's temple to be rebuilt, it would require tearing down the second most sacred site of Islam, which the Dome of the Rock is where it was Muhammad's night flight to heaven. The most sacred place is Mecca, but the second most sacred place is Jerusalem. And it is where Solomon's temple is. And of course, then, the Muslims built on top of, just like we've talked about, built on top of Solomon's temple. And they identify and see these sacred places, and I'm going to put my thing here. The temple was already destroyed, but one of the things about reforming the state of Israel and the heart and soul of Israel is Solomon's temple. So it was actually written into the Constitution that it had to rebuild Solomon's temple.
Is the wall allegedly part of the old temple?
It's part of the wall. The wall, if we look at the temple complex, so just to show, how many of you have been to Santiago de Compostela? Oh my goodness.
I didn't hear what you said.
Has anyone here been to Santiago de Compostela? It's a massive, it's almost a city unto itself. And that's what you have to visualize when you think of Solomon's temple. It's the temple complex. And the temple complex, the gods are speaking to us. The temple complex, there's layers and layers and levels to it. So that which we'll talk about, the real temple, is on the very top of Mount Moriah. But then there's all the storehouses, and then there's all the places for people to live, and then there's all the various things. And so there's layers and layers and levels. And so Solomon's temple is massive. It's the whole mountaintop. And if you go there, I haven't been there, but just in terms of what I've seen, it's this huge area. That's why there can be 2 mosques. And it's just part of that which was Solomon's temple. And these aren't small mosques either. So just brief history so we get an idea, because this is deeply connected with our spiritual traditions, being Westerners and of the Judeo-Christian background. So quickly, because of time, Abraham, patriarch of the Jewish people. Abraham was actually an initiate of the mystery centers of Mesopotamia, Babylonia. So he was, from what we would say, present-day Iraq. And this was Babylonia at the time, and it was Nineveh, which was the sacred city that he was the high priest of. And so we're going to see that we could say, and I'm just using these terms loosely right now, but as it's represented in the Bible, is that God came to Abraham and said, you are to go to the promised land, or you are to go to this new land, which is Israel, and you are to create a new people. And there will be more of your people than the stars in the sky. And Abraham was married to Sarah. And so he was a believer, and he was a man of very high consciousness. And he and Sarah went to the promised land. But the problem was they were both in their 90s. And they're supposed to populate the land of Israel. More stars in the sky. And of course they tried. But they weren't having any luck. Well, this is getting off on a sidetrack, so I'm going to leave that. Anyway, ultimately there were offspring. Lots of adventures. The Jewish people started to multiply and grow in what we know of as Israel. But then it was a time, and there were all the indigenous people there that were there before Abraham and Sarah got there. But then, as what happens frequently, Egypt came and conquered this area. As the expansion and contraction of Egypt over thousands of years was a regular kind of thing. And they took most of the Jewish people into slavery and took them back into Egypt. And so there was part of the exile in terms of the Jews in Egypt, and they became slaves, and they were involved in building the pyramids and things like this. But there was this individuality. Well, this lady then got pregnant, and she's a Jewish lady, and she couldn't take care of the child, and so she put it in a basket of bulrushes and put it in the water, and it happened to float up to the princess. No, it was actually the queen, the Pharaoh's wife, the queen of Egypt, while she was bathing in the Nile. And she decided to adopt this child, and so she adopted this child, and it was brought up within the royal household, and it was trained, and this was Moses. And Moses became the high priest of Heliopolis. Now, Heliopolis is the most sacred city in Egypt. It is the temple of the sun, and the sun, of course, is always the preeminent temple. And so he became the high priest of Heliopolis. So Moses was totally, thoroughly mastered all the Egyptian religion, spirituality, esoteric, everything. And Egypt was pretty far out, in terms of its knowledge. As you can maybe imagine by what we can still see today in terms of the temples and the pyramids and everything else. And then he gets the message that he's supposed to take his children and leave Egypt. And so he does that. And obviously we're being very brief here, and they are in the wilderness for 40 years. And there were a number of reasons for this. First of all, the Jews at that point were a slave mentality, and they had to actually wait for the next generation of Jewish people to really go into the Promised Land to create that which was to be Israel, because the slave mentality had, as if you read the Bible, you're going to see all kinds of problems in terms of this whole time that Moses took the people into Sinai and the wilderness. During this time, part of it was, Moses went up on Mount Sinai and he got the 10 Commandments and came down, and they were already worshiping false idols. And he smashed the the tablets went up and got them again, and it got another set and came down. But anyway, and at this point, then what is known as the Ark of the Covenant was created. Now, an ark is a boat, right? We know about Noah's Ark, right? So Noah's Ark, Noah is actually Manu. For those of you, we've talked about this in other classes. He was the non-human being that actually led the 25,000 roughly people out of Atlantis to form the post-Atlantean culture and civilization before it went down. So when we talk about Noah's Ark and we talk about the deluge, it was actually that of Atlantis going down. What they really failed to represent in the Old Testament about Noah, it's all about the animals. Well, that was, I'm sure there were probably some of that, but it had to do with this very select group of human beings that were actually taken. And you want to understand an ark is a symbolic thing. But part of the reason I bring it up is that if you read the dimensions of Noah's Ark, and you read the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant, and you read the dimensions of Solomon's Temple, you're going to find that they're all in proportionally the same. And it has to do, and it's deeply, so through the waters. I mean, there's a lot of symbolism here. But the ark, making it through the waters, protecting the life, the seed of life. And this is also a metaphor for what we all have to do in terms of being able to traverse through the astral dimension, which is a sea, we can say elementally of water, but it's of emotions. And the threat of the passions and the emotions of the battling, and quite frankly, it was the battle of the passions and emotions that sunk Atlantis and also sunk Lemuria, and really has the potential to sink our present culture. And it has to do with these more base, primitive feelings and emotions that are very destructive, that to the degree that we are not able to overcome them, we will not fulfill our destiny of enlightenment. So there's many levels of understanding these stories in the Bible, but part of Noah's Ark has to do with getting through the raging waters of mankind's collective emotional body that was in total turmoil, that resulted in the destruction of most of its people and the basis of its culture and civilization, in order to take that seed, that precious seed of life, and transplant it in a more auspicious way. But then when we then look at the dimensions of Noah's Ark and the dimensions of the Ark of the Covenant and Solomon's Temple, it has to do with taking the seed of life and really being able to plant it in a way that it'll flourish. The Ark of the Covenant, the tablets of the Ten Commandments were put in there, and also other sacred items that were considered the most powerful seed objects of the Jewish people, because it had been told to Abraham and Moses, etc., that they were the chosen people and that they had a special mission. And that special mission was to create the physical vehicle, the body, for the Christ being, the Creator being to incarnate into, or the Messiah. And so it gets into whole things that they were doing in Solomon's Temple, which had to do with the guiding of the marriage and the breeding, if you will, of the bloodlines over generations and generations and generations and generations and generations, to finally come up with a physical vehicle that would be an appropriate vehicle for the Christ being to enter into. And this is a whole nother part of this. And this is all about the temple, too. There's many different aspects, but it is about trying to create a proper dwelling place for the gods. And actually this was temple stuff. It was done in the temples. And in fact, Mary was a temple priestess. And Joseph had worked in the temple. And this was arranged and identified. And it wasn't like they hadn't been trying to do it with other individuals for years and years and years and years and years and years and years, because they had. It's just that finally with Mary and Joseph, they hit pay dirt. It worked. They finally got there. But these are all mysteries that go into deep stuff on all these different levels, because it's about manifesting heaven on earth. This is about the Creator being of our universe being able to take form in a physical body. And this actually being instructed and guided in terms of Solomon's Temple. So when we go back to the Ark of the Covenant, all of the seed stuff that was important to the Jewish people as being the chosen people and their whole destiny was in this Ark of the Covenant. And it was this box with these two cherubim, and it was carried on these staffs by these guys. But and every night or when they traveled, they had to put it down and actually create a tabernacle. And the tabernacle itself is laid out in all these dimensions that if you get into sacred geometry, it's laying out the same thing. And it had to do with these cloth fences around the whole thing and these inner courtyards and all these various things that they had to do with the Ark of the Covenant being the Holy of Holies and being in that spot, which I really didn't get into in terms. How any of you, maybe you, Kelly, are familiar with Schwaller de Lubitz and the Temple of Man? So have you read his stuff and you know basically the gist of it? So this fellow is a French alchemist. It was much more than that. He spent 20 years in Luxor and studying the temple there. And part of this is they show in this just mind-boggling, unbelievable way how the Egyptians, and this was one temple, incorporated the design of the human being and the physiology of man, and actually even represented the various stages of growth through the various stages of building the temple of the man. But then when we get into, and I mean every block, every inscription, everything, and this is massive, huge, has its meaning. And it relates to the very esoteric physiology of the human being, to where the Holy of Holies of this temple is directly connected with the pineal gland. And the pineal gland has to do with the 1,000-petaled lotus or the crown chakra, which has to do with conscious communion with God. And this is the degree that these people knew about esoteric physiology and the organs and the glands and the whole thing, and actually built it into stone and created that as a temple in order to do their temple activities in terms of facilitating and accelerating the development of that consciousness for those people who are involved in this. And so when we then start talking about the Ark of the Covenant and the Holy of Holies in Solomon's temple, it had a similar position in place. That this was the basis upon which they were able to commune with God. You know, I'm sure we also all saw Indiana Jones and no, that was the Vedic one. Well, anyway, I can't remember the title of it now. The Raiders of the Lost Ark. Raiders of the Lost Ark. And so actually there's a lot in there that's really true. I mean, the Nazis did try to get this stuff, and there's all this stuff. Anyway, so they traipse around the desert for 40 years, and every time they have to create this tabernacle, which is kind of a temporary temple. The Ark of the Covenant is the centerpiece for it. And there was also a thing, Moses couldn't go into the Promised Land. He had to die first, and then basically Joshua was the one who had to take the Jewish people from the wilderness into what we know of as Israel, the Holy Land, Palestine. And there are all these indigenous tribes, and then there's years and years of fighting. They're trying to subdue the surrounding people and establish their own thing. And again, quickly, time. We have Saul was the first king, and then we have David, who was the second king. And one of the things you want to know is they hadn't built anything. They were just kind of out there fighting and trying to claim land, and they hadn't really built much of a civilization or anything at that point. But David got the design of Solomon's temple from God. I'm just, again, using this term loosely. And to give you an idea, kind of his palace, it wasn't really a palace at that point, it was just where he hung out in this part of the area of Mount Moriah. And down in his yard, I'm being a little facetious, but it's true. Just down in his yard was the Ark of the Covenant. They just parked this thing down there because they hadn't built a temple. And the Ark of the Covenant needed a temple. But they hadn't been in a position to build a temple. So this Ark of the Covenant was out here and just hanging out. I mean, they were still doing stuff with it, but it varied depending upon what was going on. Anyway, then it was David's son, Solomon, who actually built the temple. He didn't have the plan, he got it from his father. And this gets into the temple legend, and this is a thing that we aren't going to have time to get into tonight. I'm going to give you some rough outlines so that it gives you a certain sense and idea, and it will be something that I'll get into more. And there's a number of things that we're mentioning tonight that really would be more adequately addressed in a class unto themselves. We come into an interesting situation when we come to the temple legend, and we come to this Solomon and the building of Solomon's temple. So Solomon had the design, he had the plan, but none of the Jewish people had any of the skills to build the temple. Now this gets into a deeper thing about understanding mankind and a dynamic that's going on all of the time that we may or may not be able to be aware of. And it goes back to this whole thing of Cain and Abel. And again, not going into a lot of detail just because of the time, but Cain, so you've probably heard the terms the Son of God and the Son of Man, or the sons of God or the sons of man. And the Christ being represented himself as both, which is very interesting. But we're going to find the sons of man are Cain, and the sons of God are Abel, or the lineage that comes down from these two. And the sons of man are those spiritual beings, those human souls, whose job it is to go out and master the world. They're the ones that do the work. If you go back and read the Bible, you'll find, okay, they were to go out, Cain and Abel were supposed to go out and do their work and then bring the rewards of their work back and sacrifice and give it to God. And so Cain goes out and he plows the fields and he works and he grows crops and all of that kind of stuff and works and he brings the harvest to God and sacrifices it or gives it to him. And Abel is a shepherd and he goes out and he is a shepherd and he just multiplies the flocks, taking care of the sheep, and takes the sheep there and sacrifices the sheep to God. Well, God rejected Cain's sacrifice and accepted Abel's sacrifice. Huh? I mean, it gets into deep things. What's going on here? And so Cain is the sons of man, which it means that these are an aspect of humanity that has to do with conquering the world and developing all the arts and sciences and technologies and the building of outer civilization. So the building of cities and the building of corporations and the building, farms. It's man's skill applied to the world where he creates the result of it. And these are the sons of man. And this is Cain. Abel and the lineage of Abel has to do with those who really accept the world as it is. And from a divine spiritual place. So what is Abel? He's a shepherd. And he's basically just working with nature and the laws of nature and the natural things without, and just allowing that to happen. And in the process, he's really not trying to conquer the world. He's really aligning with God and flowing with the laws of nature and flowing with the divine plan in this regard. And we'll find that the lineage of Abel are the priesthood. And in fact, for mystery, which we'll get into more in next month's class about the divine masculine and feminine, we'll actually find that Abel is the divine feminine. And that the natural priesthood for humanity is the feminine. And that has been taken away. I mean, we'll say, kidnapped or whatever. That's a whole nother story. But don't worry, it's coming back to the way it should be. And then Cain has to do with the captains of industry, if you will, in terms of making this world as we know it. So there's this battle. There's actually a division, there's actually a conflict, there's actually a rivalry, there's an actual misunderstanding between these two aspects of humanity. We could say ones that are very spiritual, ones that are very material. And so this all has to, in the process, get balanced, harmonized, and integrated. So here we have this with Solomon. He's of Abel. He's got the plan. He's with God. He's got the divine plan. But the Jewish people don't have any skills to build it. So they have to go to King Hiram of Tyre, who has a people and a culture and a civilization that has these skills. And he sends Hiram Abiff, who is the master mason, to come and build Solomon's temple. And of course it was all, contracts and paid for and all that kind of stuff. So all of Hiram's people come and they build the temple. And I'm just being very quick. And again, there's a real division here and there's some real conflict. So the Queen of Sheba shows up, who is engaged to Solomon. And, Solomon is this amazing guy. He's very wealthy and very wise and been very successful and all this. But she comes and she sees Solomon's temple and she's just blown away. Whoa, I've got to meet who built this. So Solomon introduced the Queen of Sheba to Hiram. And so she falls for Hiram. And this kind of created some conflict. And this is again, we're being very brief and quick because it leads to some other things. But the piece de resistance, the icing on the cake in terms of the building of Solomon's temple, was called the Molten Sea. And it was this casting in bronze that was to be in the foyer or the entrance part of the outer temple that would actually be this massive, it was on the backs of 12 oxen, bronze oxen. This massive circular casting of bronze that was going to be showing this tumultuous sea cast in bronze. And it was, it was just, like the finest of artistic kind of achievements. And so he was going to do this final piece, and there were three masons, and this gets into the masons thing. That were of the second degree, and Hiram had overlooked them in terms of initiating them into the third degree with master masons. And after the job of Solomon's temple was completed, they wanted to go off and do their own gigs, but they really couldn't unless they were master masons. So they were kind of pissed. And they were helping Hiram in terms of casting of this molten sea, and they sabotaged the casting of the molten sea so that it all started running out all over the place. And it was a disaster. And so Hiram throws water on it, and of course, to try to stop it, to freeze it up. But then that just results in an explosion. We can say this gets into esoteric stuff. And then Hiram actually goes to the center of the earth and encounters his ancestor, Tubal-Cain, who is kind of officially the master of all of these worldly arts and sciences and technologies and all this stuff. And Hiram is initiated by him, and he comes back. But the molten sea is no longer, it's basically not part of Solomon's temple. It never got fixed. And these three masons were still pissed. They had to get the word, which is the initiatic. Each level of initiation, you got different instruction, and you got different handshakes, and you got a different word, password, if you will. And they needed that in order to prove that they were master masons, but he hadn't given it to them, so they wanted it. So he tries to get out. So Hiram tries to get out of the temple, and he goes out. I think it was the west side, and one of them hits him in the throat. All this is symbolism too. It hits him in the throat with a T-cross, with a square, T-square, and cuts him in the throat. And then he runs to the southern part of the temple and tries to get out there. And one of the other masons stops him and hits him in the head with a hammer. And then I can't remember. He goes out one other way. He's trying to go out another way, and I can't remember what the instrument was and what part of the body he was hit. But then he dies. He's killed by his three underlings. And this is kind of bad. And so, they try to hide it, and they bury him. There's a whole thing about burying him and how it was done, and it was a hidden grave and all that. Anyway, so he was finally discovered and dug up, and because Hiram was the master mason, this gets into a whole tradition that has to do with the lost word. Now, this is a very big deal, but the present-day Masons have really lost its meaning. It has something to do with our ability in the future, which we had in the past, and it's how we destroyed Lemuria. But it is about the power of the word. And it is, if you're in the right state of consciousness and you know the name of something, and I mean the esoteric spiritual name, which is based upon the vibrational frequency of that thing or that being, and you're able to articulate that name, then you will actually see it will actually take form. And that is actually how the creation came into existence. This whole creation was sung or spoken into existence. So it gets into this whole deep mystery of the Word. But mankind has lost the power of that. It goes back to the Tower of Babel and a bunch of other things. But in Masonry, it's this thing of this initiatic word about being entered into this highest level of initiation in terms of Masonry. And they think it's the word that has to do with this whole Hiram Abiff story. But it doesn't, because it relates to Maitreya Buddha, the next Buddha, who is coming, and that being is going to be coming in and re-enlivening our ability to actually enliven the throat chakra to the point where we do reclaim the ability of the word, to where we can actually speak into existence that it's a whole nother higher form of creativity. And at that point, again, we were androgynous back in Lemuria, meaning there was no separation of the sexes then, and that's going to be happening again in the future. We're in this phase now where we're masculine and feminine, and we need each other in order to have offspring. It wasn't the way it was originally, and it isn't the way it's going to be. But this is still about 1,500 years from now. But we will actually speak our offspring into existence. And this then gets into the art and science of the lost word. And it isn't just about our own offspring. It has to do with, basically, being able to manifest anything through the science of sound. So it goes into this, and one of the things you'll find about all these temples, and modern architects, engineers, etc., cannot reproduce this, is the science of acoustics that was built into these temples. And so you'll find this sound thing, and the whole thing of chanting, and the whole thing of the invocations, and all this was like this sound chamber that created these vibrational frequencies that were directly related to the invoking of the gods. We'll even find this in a lot of the cathedrals. So what ends up happening is, okay, in 500 AD, this was 950 AD roughly that Solomon's AD. 950 BC, the Solomon's temple was built. And it was destroyed. The Babylonians came in and took over Israel and destroyed the temple in about 550 BC. And then the exile, where a lot of them, the main power people, were taken into exile in Babylonia. And the rest were left there, and things were just, for about 50 years, it just kind of lay fallow. And then in exile, Ezekiel has the vision in terms of the design of the second temple, and a lot of other things too. And then Cyrus, the Persian king, comes and defeats the Babylonians, frees the Jews, allows them to go back to their land, and actually funds the building of the Second Temple. And then that is basically there until, Herod, which is the time of Christ. We're going to find he was the governor, the Roman governor at the time, and he made a lot of additions and improvements and expansions to the Second Temple. And then it was in 70 A.D., or, we're talking AD, so technically 33 AD is the crucifixion. At 70 AD was when the Romans came in and destroyed the temple, wiped out Israel, basically the diaspora, where they were spread all over the world, because for hundreds of years, earlier with the Greek rulers and then with the Roman rulers, the Jews were always rebelling and revolting, and really not conforming to what the rulers wanted, the outside rulers. So the Romans finally got tired of it, and they just basically came in and ripped down the temple. Just totally destroyed it, and basically took into exile all of the Jewish leaders, and it was the beginning of the diaspora, and that was the end of Solomon's temple. But it's still this archetype, because if you encountering the spiritual hierarchies, the ascended masters, in this body of knowledge, you will find that it is pretty universally recognized that the most perfect temple to represent the macrocosm in the microcosm that mankind has created was Solomon's temple. And so we're going to find that this is the ultimate archetype, if you will, of this temple and this whole temple legend, which gets into all kinds of stuff. And quickly, I'll try to make this concise because we're getting late. So let's revisit this. And this is the First Crusade. And this is about 1095 AD. Islam is pounding on the doors of, well, we had the split of the Roman Empire and the split of Christianity in terms of the West and the East. We have the Pope in the Vatican in Rome, and we have the head of the Eastern Church, the Greek Orthodox Church in Constantinople, where Constantine had gone there to really basically, he saw the writing on the wall. He was the one who officially made Christianity, he made Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. So then it becomes institutionalized, and then it grows, and all kinds of wonderful and strange and weird things happen. But anyway, so we're talking about 1095 AD, and Islam has been conquering the world, and it's pounding on the doors of Constantinople, and the head of the church in Constantinople pleads to the Pope, look, can you get these guys off, help us get these guys off our back, you know, the Muslim warriors. And so the Pope orders the First Crusade. And so then, you know, if you want to get to heaven, you got to, you know, go out and battle the infidel. And one of the other primary things was that it was a basic thing of the Christian church to do pilgrimage to the Holy Land to be a good Christian. It's just like today in terms of Islam, to be a good Muslim, you need to go to Mecca. You need to do a pilgrimage to Mecca. And so, of course, when Muslims took over the Holy Land, Christians couldn't go to the Holy Land anymore. They couldn't do pilgrimage there anymore. And that's why Santiago became such a big deal, because officially the church said, okay, if you can't go to the Holy Land, then you've got to go to Santiago de Compostela to be a good Christian. And that's the Camino, and you guys have probably heard about it, etc. And so anyway, so the First Crusade happens, and we actually, you know, the Christians actually win. They kick them out, and it's tenuous, but they actually hold the land for 250 years. We actually hold this area for 250 years. And what comes out of this are the Templars, or the Knights of the Temple. And we're going to find there were 9 French knights that were very involved in the conquering of the Holy Land and of Jerusalem, and they made their base Solomon's Temple. And they lived there, and they made this their base. And these are stories, but they're true, and it's quick. But they basically started digging underneath the temple, and they found something. We don't know. It's a big mystery. We don't know exactly what they found, but it was some big deal, because they immediately went from Jerusalem back to France. And they met with the King of France, and they met with the Pope. And based upon what it is they brought back, the Pope made them a mystical military order called the Knights of the Temple, Poor Knights of the Temple, the Templars. And they reported to no one except the Pope. And also St. Bernard of Clairvaux, very, very elevated being, was the one who was basically told to write the orders for the Templars. And so the orders are basically, you know, what this order was about and how you were to live and everything else. So they had to be celibate. They had to give up all their property or money. They had to, you know, do their spiritual practice and meditations and prayers so many times a day. They had a thing that they could never retreat from battle. So they were some of the fiercest, toughest warriors that the world had ever seen, because it was, they couldn't retreat. Didn't matter what the situation was. They had to battle to the death. And so they were incredible. But they were also primarily from the aristocracy. These 9 French knights were all aristocrats, and they were in lineage for kingships and all of this kind of stuff. So it basically attracted the nobility from all over Europe to become Templars. But in order to become a Templar, you had to hand over all your wealth, all your lands, all your castles, all your villages, all your industries, everything else. So we're going to find that the Templars became an incredibly wealthy, powerful organization. In fact, the most powerful organization in Europe, and it was totally international. It was in every country. And so they were very powerful, and they protected the pilgrims going to the Holy Land, etc. Anyway, they, shortly after this flowering of the Templars, we find that there was this massive cathedral building that started happening in Europe, and the cathedrals that most of you went to. 200 cathedrals were built in a period of 200 years. And it's still kind of a mystery in terms of where the money came from that built these cathedrals, where the knowledge came from, because it became a whole new architecture, a whole new style that we know as Gothic. And part of this is related to the design of Solomon's Temple and the Christianizing of it. So one of the big issues in terms of Christianity, as far as building churches or temples, was to differentiate the architecture of their temple, which is the cathedral, from that of pagan temples. And you're going to find one of the basic designs of a cathedral is it's in the form of a cross. And this, of course, gets into the crucifixion, but it has very much to do with the design of the human being. And it has to do with deep esoteric mysteries that relate to the whole creation and to the Christ being that's the creator being of our universe. And when you're a creator being, one of the cosmic laws is you must incarnate into your creation, which is what happened 2,000 years ago when the Christ came into Jesus at the Christ event. And I'm not going to get into all of that stuff, but that's what happened. But in the bigger picture, what this cross has to do with is the design of an archetype that's fundamental to this creation is the spirit must be crucified on the cross of matter. Meaning that this whole process of spirit manifesting into physical form and entering into this physical dimensional reality is putting boundaries and limitations on the unboundedness of spirit, which spirit is totally unbounded in its nature, in love and wisdom and power and everything else. But when we put it in the boundaries of the physical dimension, it actually is put in limitation and boundaries, and in a metaphysical and very deeply correct understanding that's much more esoteric, we are finding the spirit is crucified on the cross of matter, because the cross is the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water. And it gets into all kinds of other things. This is very deep stuff. So when we talk about the crucifixion, yeah, we can talk about it on a zillion different levels, but there's a deeper esoteric teaching that is related to the very design of the cathedrals, the Gothic cathedrals, that is in the form of the cross. And you'll find that from the western entrance, when you enter the facade and the doors, and you walk up the nave, and you're going to find 2/3 of the way up, there is the transept. And the transept are these areas that go out from this long vertical thing that goes out like this, which is the cross. And then up here you're going to find that is the choir or the apse. And then you get into this area that would really be the Holy of Holies. And one of the things to understand, so the cathedrals are the temples of Christianity. And there's a whole evolution of this. And within each temple design, as we talked about, depending upon what the orientation of that spiritual path is, you're going to find there's a different design, there's different orientations, etc. And you're going to find the true cathedrals are all oriented in terms of the apse being in the east. We enter the front doors of the cathedral in the west, and the west symbolically represents death and ignorance. And so we're entering into this holy sacred space in order to be transformed from death and ignorance into life and enlightenment. And we're going to find as we walk down the nave of the cathedral, we're heading toward the apse, and this is this rounded part at the end that usually is all stained glass, floor to ceiling stained glass. And we want to understand that all the cathedrals are oriented towards the rising sun, or the east. Why? Because the Christ being is the spirit of the sun. And it gets into all kinds of esoteric stuff about this being and the light. I am the light of the world. Here is the light. This whole thing is oriented to the rising sun and the light shining through the stained glass windows. And just being enveloped in this, because that's really very much what it is that we're trying to do on the spiritual path, is step into the light, to walk into the light, to grow into the light. And here we'll find the very design of the cathedral is in this way, that. And then we will find that again, it's very much of light. I mean, first of all, as some of you have said, it's awesome. I mean, amiens, to give you an idea, the height of the ceiling is 150 feet. You get such an expanse, and it's expansion towards the heavens. You get this feeling of upliftment, and you will find in most of the old temples The ceilings were covered with stars. We want to understand that the roofs are always representing the celestial and that which relates to the heavens. And that, of course, is truly, in understanding this correctly, is our home. That is our home. When we look at those stars and we look at the sky, we're all from some star system. This is not our home. This is a schoolroom that we're learning specific kinds of consciousness and specific abilities, but this isn't our home. And so we're going to find that this whole thing is wanting to open us up to the celestial heavenly influence, and then this whole thing of light. And we're going to find that stained glass is one of the arts. In fact, in Chartres, for example, you're going to find that when modern people try to replicate the stained glass that was in there, they can't. This gets into a whole nother thing, because the glass was made alchemically, which is on a whole nother level. This is not regular glass, and the color in it is not regular color. And it's a whole other thing about understanding the cathedrals, because the church didn't design these, and the church didn't fund them. And it gets into the mysteries. The Templars brought the money, and the Templars brought the designs. And they were the basis of the cathedral building, and they were bringing this esoteric knowledge that goes back to Solomon's temple, and they were transforming it into a Christian format for this massive period of time in which there was this temple building. And they contained within the structure, as does every temple, the esoteric spiritual teachings that are inherent within that body of knowledge. And so we're going to find very inherently within Christianity, as within any of these traditions, but in a way that we can relate to it to a degree, is alchemy. We know that the resurrection body of the Christ, in terms of the crucifixion and the resurrection, the diamond body or the resurrection body is turned the mineral into total light, or a diamond body. And we're going to find this is part of the alchemical process. And if you know and understand the initiatic language, you can go around these cathedrals and read how the people that built it wrote in the statuary, in the stained glass windows, in the stories that are represented in stone and light and windows, etc. The alchemical knowledge of self-transformation and transmutation, or what is supposed to be happening in terms of the Mass of transubstantiation. Because inherent within the Mass, in the center of the Holy of Holies of where the cathedrals are the actual spiritual rites that actually do what it says. It says they've been tampered with and they have been corrupted, so they aren't as effective as they were. If you wanted to get into Greek Orthodoxy or Russian Orthodoxy, you're going to get a much purer representation of the Mass with much more profound effectiveness than you will in terms of the Vatican and Western Catholicism. But the whole heart and soul of this Christian mystery, this bread is my body, this wine is my blood, and it literally has to do with the transmutation or the transubstantiation, transformation of substance, matter, from matter into spirit, from darkness into light. And you will find this knowledge built and structured into these cathedrals. Chartres is an unbelievable example, because every one of them is a little different. They're built by different, but there was a shared knowledge. This relates to the guilds of the Masons, which gets into Masonry, which I'm not going to get into tonight. But when the Templars were wiped out, they went underground and they resurfaced as the Masons. But these were the guild Masons that actually built these monasteries and built these cathedrals that had the knowledge. But then when the Templars started taking it over, they changed it from guild masonry to speculative masonry. That's technically what it's called. And this was where then they started using all of the archetypes of building the temple as actual masons, of actually building a temple or a cathedral, into a metaphoric thing of building the temple of man. So now we come to the ultimate temple, and that is the human being. And we are going to find that the design of the human being is the same design as the cosmos. And we're going to see that the design of the human being is the same design as the temples. And it's all a question of proportion. In fact, if we want to really have our mind blown, we read those spiritual traditions, of which there are many, of those individualities which have actually had the spiritual experience of being in that state of awareness where they've actually been able to step outside of the creation and look back at it. And looking back at it, this creation is in the form of a cosmic man. And we will find in the Vedic tradition, this is known as the divine Purusha. And in the Kabbalistic tradition, it's known as Adam Kadmon. And we are going to find that the entire cosmos, the entire creation, is actually in the design of a man. And we're going to see these proportions. When we say that we are the microcosm of the macrocosm, we're not just using metaphorical language. And we're going to see that, so when we then talk about the human being and the physiology, we're going to find, just to give ourselves an example in terms of the celestial and the terrestrial, and those of you who are astrologers, but Aries, the sign of the zodiac, or the constellation, or that grouping of stars that we know of as Aries, rules the head. What do you think that means, rules the head? We can be really abstract about it. It means the very design of the head comes from this sign of the zodiac, and these spiritual beings that are these colonies of spiritual beings that form the star system of Aries are the ones that actually design the head. And all of that that's in it. Taurus rules the neck. Gemini rules the shoulders and the arms and the hands. Cancer rules the breast and the stomach. Leo rules the heart. Virgo rules the intestines. Libra rules the hips. Scorpio rules the reproductive organs. Sagittarius rules the thighs. Capricorn rules the knees. Aquarius rules the shins and the ankles. Pisces rules the feet. And we can go through the planetary rulerships. We can break all of this down. But what I'm saying is we are the design of the cosmos. And literally, these spiritual beings create and manifest within our very being and bring these qualities of intelligence, these qualities of energy into our very being. And so I'm just being very basic here and talking about the 12 signs of the zodiac. If I started talking about the planets, they rule the chakras, they rule the various organs, the various aspects of our being. But even if we go outside, or if we even look at the chakras and we start talking about the petals and all of this stuff, we can get into every aspect and all the detail that we want to in terms of the very cosmic nature of who we are. So when we get into that, which is Masonry, it would be the theme is, and it isn't just Masonry, it's every spiritual tradition, but it would be talking about our own spiritual development and our own spiritual path as building the temple with no hammers and with no noise. And you're going to find that when we start talking about whether it's a T-square or a hammer or a chalk line or a chisel or a level or a plumb bob or whatever it may be, all of these tools of the architects and the masons are incorporated as representing cosmic laws that are necessary for the spiritual development of the human being, so that every one of these different tools that are necessary to build the outer temple in an esoteric way represent the cosmic laws that are necessary in terms of being applied to building the inner temple. So we're going to find that the very design of the human being is the entire cosmos. So when we start talking about galaxies and organs and various parts of the physiology and constellations, etc., these are these different aspects of the cosmic consciousness that are actually structured into our own physiology, and to where, as we systematically through time activate these different aspects of our being, we actually move into a state of cosmic consciousness, which is not an abstraction. It's quite real, where we then have consciously reconnected with all these different aspects of our being that are totally cosmic, yet are structured within our being. We are the microcosm of the macrocosm, and as above, so below, as below, so above. And so when we get into this whole thing of the temple, we are going to find it's all about the divine design and the whole divine purpose that really is about creation. Okay, so let's assume, and part of the thing about the Masons, they would say, you have to turn the rough ashlar into the perfected ashlar. Ashlar is the term that they use for the rough stone. What is a cathedral made of? What is a temple made of? It is made of stone. And so the stone has to be shaped and it has to be refined, etc. And all these processes need to be gone through to where that stone is ready to be made part of the temple. And it would be saying that every individual is one of those stones. And this, that we build the greater temple, each one of us doing our own work, perfecting ourselves and perfecting the ashlar. This is the building of this larger temple, which is the temple of humanity. So here we come to this next level of understanding that this brings up the social question or the social issue. We can talk about this in terms of the spiritual path and us doing our work individually, etc., but what about everybody else? What about the world? When we start looking at the 7 races, the different religions of the world, all the different nations, there's over 200 nations, these are all we want to know with every race is a particular specialization of consciousness that is evolving through that particular form. That others, that it's making a contribution that no other race can contribute. Every religion has a particular specialization of consciousness that no other religion can really do, except we will find that Christianity actually includes them all. But we will find that they represent specializations of consciousness that are very important for the evolution of consciousness for humanity. When we talk about nations and this nation consciousness or these collectivities, group consciousness that we know of as nations, we're going to find that there's a specialization of consciousness on the collective level that is unfolding within that nation that no other nation and no other people can unfold. And when we look more specifically in a more spiritual manner, we're going to find that there is an archangel or a folk spirit that overlights each one of these group consciousnesses, whether that's a racial group consciousness, whether it is a religious group consciousness, whether it is a national group consciousness. And we're going to find that every one of these is a piece in the greater puzzle of that which is humanity. And the building of this greater temple, which is that of humanity, is something that we are involved in, and that is this greater project that we're involved in. And right now is a very critical time in this whole thing, because obviously we're not really getting along really well with each other. And the social question is a major issue. How do you really create a society where the individuality is respected, but yet we're able to come together in harmony? And one of the things we want to understand, it's not like all these people, nations, religions, and races are supposed to be all the same, like there's supposed to be some homogeneous collective consciousness that's the same. No, you want to be very clear and understand that every one of these groups must establish its own cultural integrity. Just like we have to be true to ourselves to unfold our true individuality, to blossom and flower into that perfection and expression we ultimately are. Every nation must do that, every race must do that, every religion must do that. And so this has to do with which most people totally forget about, especially us Americans, where we're so ethnocentric and we really think everybody should be like us, which is absolutely wrong, is that this thing of cultural integrity is imperative. It will never work if the integrity of the people or the race or the religion is not honored to allow it to really come into its own. So it's bringing all of this diversity into unity. This is the greater temple of mankind. And we see the picture of this in Revelations in terms of the New Jerusalem. And we are going to find that this is actually, if you do, again, the calculations for the New Jerusalem that are given by John in Revelations, you're going to find the calculations for the New Jerusalem are the earth, the planet Earth. It's the whole earth. And it's representing this heaven on earth. It's representing us fulfilling and completing the divine plan as it has been designed. And the symbol for it is the New Jerusalem. And it is the result of us doing our work individually and collectively and creating a culture of light and a civilization of light on this planet to where we become a sun, because we are in the process of becoming a sun. And just a quick thing, we are going to find, and I think I've mentioned this before, but one of the New Jerusalems, because there's many, is over Lake Tahoe, and it has been activated. And it was the first one in the entire world that was activated. So we are going to find, and there's many other things, that this area is very sacred and it's very profound, and in many respects it's very much ahead of its time. And certain prototypes and certain things are being established here that are going to be important, not just for here, but other places. So I would leave you with this thought that may you build your temple. Thank you very much for coming.